First Things, episode number 44.
I seem to be lost.
And so you're working around the clock so you don't take time for yourself to feel like an actual human being.
I used to feel like no matter how hard I worked, I was just spinning my wheels.
Trying to be perfect, we try to have everything in place at one point in time, and you can't.
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to First Things, the podcast dedicated to practical productivity based on modern research. My name is Brandon Vaughn, and my goal is to help you apply productive solutions to your life to help you live with less stress, greater passion, and amazing results. So good to have you back with us today as we are nearing the end of our study on assertiveness. We have been going week by week through the topics of the Assertiveness workbook, and we are now into kind of the worst case scenarios, especially starting next week. This week we are in chapter 14 of the book, which is called Making Request Without Controlling Others. Here's how the author begins this particular chapter. He says, being assertive usually means controlling your own behavior without attempting to control the behavior of anyone else. For example, when you say no, you assert your right to decide for yourself what you will and will not do. Setting this boundary can be extremely difficult for the non-assertive person. The situation becomes more complicated when we make requests of other people. At first glance, it can look like we're trying to control their behavior. For example, I want you to fill up my car when you use it. Now, in reality, we are simply stating what we would like to happen. We are informing others of our desires. We leave it up to them to decide whether they will go along with the request. They keep control over their own actions. We retain control over our own actions, including the response we make if they do or do not grant the request. For example, otherwise, I will be less willing to loan you the car in the future. Now, again, some of the topics we've been talking about may have come as a bit of a surprise. For example, how to receive a positive compliment. That may have been a little bit surprising as we've gone through this study on assertiveness. And maybe this might be a little bit of a different thing, because usually when people think of assertiveness, again, they misinterpret it as aggressive behavior or aggressive responses to people. They usually think of conflict, manipulation, guilt, things like that, which is definitely something that we've been talking about, something that we will end up with. But here's a very interesting aspect of assertiveness is that we need to be able to make requests from other people. However, as we've said at the very beginning, all the way throughout this series, assertiveness is not about getting your own way. It is about the fact that you are responsible for you and how you feel and how you respond, and other people have that same dignity. And you have to give people that dignity. That it isn't about changing their mind and them seeing it your way. It is a matter of you being honest with who you are and expressing that, but doing it in such a way that you're not trying to manipulate the other person. And this can be why making requests can be very stressful for many people, because some people feel like it is controlling them. It is about manipulation. And this is especially true of people who have more of a dominant passive style of communication. Many people in this area just feel like they don't have the right to ask for anything, or that it would be rude, or they maybe even fear the consequences. What is that person going to do if I say no to them? Or what if they think that I'm stupid for asking this question? Or what if I'm being just unreasonable about this whole thing? And as such, passive style communicators will typically avoid asking anything, even if it's really in their right to do so. Even if it seems perfectly reasonable that they do so, they will hope usually that someone will just notice, that someone will notice that they are a little bit droopy maybe, and will somehow read their mind and provide whatever it is that this person is thinking. And we all know, especially those of us who have catered to these types of communication styles for a lot of our lives, we know, frankly, that doesn't happen very often. And we have to really go out of our way to try to set up something that someone will even notice us to begin with. And then they always seem to miss what was the matter. So we may droop and act real sluggish and pouty and different things like that. And then a person will notice and say, well, what's wrong? Oh, I know what it is. It's this and that. And you're thinking, no, it's not that. And you just totally misinterpret it because we don't even tell people that at all. So what's the end result? Well, we feel angry. We feel used. We feel resentful. Also, some people have aggressive styles and they feel very entitled, and therefore they make demands. They think they're making requests of people, but they're actually just making demands of people. You must do what I say. And if people don't do what they say, or they do it very poorly, or if they do it very slowly, then they become very angry. And then the other style, which is probably the most dangerous of all, is the passive-aggressive style. And this style doesn't make any request or demands, very much like the passive style, But instead, what they do is they try to force other people into doing what they want. The author gives this as an example. He's constantly using the example in the book about someone borrowing your car. So the example says, I know I'll leave the car almost empty, then he'll be forced to gas it up. So the whole thing is that he wants this person to fill up his car if he lends it to him. And the passive-aggressive approach says, I'm not even going to ask him this. I'm just going to leave the car empty, and he's going to have no choice but to fill it up. And I don't know if you've ever tried that before. I have. I've literally done this before, and it doesn't really work. It ends up that somehow I've had one time where they've squeezed even more gas and brought it back to me even more empty than what they had before. I've had one person put in like $2 or $3 and basically left me right where I was before. I mean, stuff like that just doesn't work like we think it would work. It's the same thing when I've lent people books, and I have a pretty big library of books. And I've sometimes lent people books, and they've asked me for books, and instead of making myself known, what we said last week, just saying no, I would lend them these books, and I would kiss them goodbye because I would never see them again. And so what I started doing was something kind of more detrimental to myself and expensive, is that if I ever lent a book to someone, I would just give it to them and buy myself another copy. Many times, though, I wouldn't tell the person I was giving them the book because I just knew I would never see it again. And so I should have probably even said, listen, I'm just going to give you this book. No, I lent them the book, but I lent them the book knowing I would not get it back. So I usually would go ahead and replace it at the same moment, which again is just kind of a wacky way of avoiding talking to people and dealing with confrontation, dealing with making your request, dealing with just saying no to people. Now, the interesting thing about the passive-aggressive approach is that other people typically will notice what you're trying to do, that manipulation you're trying to do, more than the person that is the passive-aggressive style. It's really interesting. Many, many times when I've been passive-aggressive like this, and I think that I'm being in a stealth mode, no one really knows what I'm doing, and I'm hidden from view. A lot of times, the person that I was passive-aggressive to actually knew that I was doing that, and they could pick it up pretty easily. I wasn't quite as hidden as I thought I was, and I think it would scare a lot of us, those of us who do dip into this passive-aggressive style. I think it would alarm a lot of us if we found out exactly how often people see through that in our very lives. Now, the author gives many different tips and observations for making requests. The first tips that he gives are a little bit more basic, and then the next ones were based a little bit more on research. But the very first thing you need to do is to ask yourself what you would like to happen in a particular situation. And at this point, you should try to exclude all types of emotions, not really worry about what other people think, what other people feel, what other people's rights are. It's just simply trying to figure out what is going on in that situation, what you would like to see happen. Then, before you actually make your request, you should now look at it and think about what is actually reasonable under these circumstances. To not underestimate your rights, but also think of other people's rights as well. This is what Stephen Covey has mentioned, that we've mentioned many times on the show, is thinking of a win-win situation. Is there any kind of win-win situation where both people will win in this particular case? We've said this before in the no episode, but don't apologize for asking about something. You actually have a right to ask for just about anything as long as you recognize that the other person has the right to refuse. And see, that's the important thing. Some of us have got to really get over this mentality that we do not have a right to ask. Really, you have a right to ask for anything. Anything you want, you have the right to ask, as long as you are willing for the other person to say no, or the other person to refuse. This is the assertive lifestyle. The aggressive lifestyle says, I'm going to do whatever it takes to make you do this. And that is manipulation, and that's not what we're about. The passive style is all about that I'm just going to be your slave again, and I'm going to do whatever you want me to do, but I'm not going to say no to anything like that. And that isn't right, because many of us want certain things and we just simply don't ask for it. And then that passive-aggressive style says, well, you watch me, I'm going to go cloak and dagger and hide in stealth mode and twist the circumstances to where you will do what I want you to do. And that doesn't get us anywhere. The assertive style says, I have a right to ask for just about anything that I want, as long as I also recognize that the other person has the right to say no. And if you really grasp this thing of the assertive style of communication, then apologizing for asking is wrong. It's not the optimal way of living your life, because you don't have to say, well, I'm sorry for asking this. Well, no, don't be sorry for asking. You have a right to ask for things in life. That is part of the assertive lifestyle. And as we said in the no episode, we've also got to avoid putting ourselves down as part of the request. Well, I'm sorry for asking this. I'm so stupid. I just totally forgot this. Can you do this for me? See, I'm apologizing, but I'm also putting myself down. Oh, I hate asking this. I'm so disorganized sometimes. Would you mind helping me do this? See, we're putting ourselves down in the process. You can request something. You can ask something of someone else without being demeaning toward yourself. You are a wonderful, amazing person. And I know that I'm speaking to some people right now who maybe roll your eyes when I say that. Or you may say, well, that's true of other people you're talking to, Brandon, but it's not true about me. You don't know me. And I want to beg to differ with you. You are an amazing person. And if you feel like you're not going anywhere in life, well, that's just where you are presently. That isn't where you can be or where you will be. You've got to avoid putting yourself down. I keep mentioning this almost every week, but we will eventually come back and do a whole series over identity and self-worth issues, because it's extremely important that we start basing our identity off of other things than what people say about us or our performance. The other tip that he gives is to word your request as a request and not as a demand. And this can be very hard many times to do, especially when you get into work relationships where you're dealing with a boss or a boss is dealing with a worker. But it is possible, and I think that we would be much better off if we can strive toward really phrasing ourselves as requests and not demanding something. Now, the author then goes in to describe a systematic way of making requests for people, something that two authors, Bauer and Bauer, mention in their book called Asserting Yourself, and they called it DESC, for describe, express, specify, and consequences. Now, the author of this book changes up the very last word, and instead of consequences, he chooses outcome. So it's DESO, D-E-S-O, describe, express, specify, and outcome. And he says the reason why he chose outcome instead of consequences is because consequences basically sounds a little bit too negative. And outcome was something that was a little bit more soothing to him as he was thinking about this. Now, this is a systematic way of basically making a request. And usually I'm not big into formulas. And so when I go through this, I want you to be somewhat discerning of whether you want to really think this through in steps every time you make a request. But if you have a real big problem, especially if you're dealing with passive styles and you need some kind of a formula or some type of systematic way to help you bridge the gap to making requests, then this is a good way of doing it. But I think that we're much better off if we don't live our lives scripted, that we can live it spontaneous, live it in the now moment. But I do think it's good to practice these types of things. So the first step, if you're going to make a request, is to describe. That is, before you make the request, you need to define the situation. What is actually happening? What is going on that you need to make a request? And you need to be as clear as you can without being long-winded. And that can be very hard. Can you actually describe what is going on without going into a large dialogue of 5 or 10 minutes? So you're at work and you want to make a request about an extension to a deadline. And so you would first describe the situation. You know, there's a lot happening this week with all of the new product releases. And that's just a statement. You're describing the situation and why you're going to request for a deadline extension, just simply stating it without going into too much detail. Now, the author says this. He says, if your request has to do with someone else's behavior, then focus on the behavior rather than on the person's personality or motives. He gives some examples of this. Here's something that's not great to say. You're lazy and inconsiderate. A better way of saying it, you haven't yet done the chore you agreed to do last week. Another example, not very good. You're paying me so badly because you think you can get away with it. A better way of saying it, I'm not making as much as other people who have this job. If you listen very closely, you'll notice on the better types of responses, it was focused more on the behavior rather than the person's performance, their personality, their motives, and things like that. Behavior is a lot easier to talk about because it's less open to debate. So if someone hasn't, for example, done the chore, as it mentioned, well, that's very obvious. If they were supposed to clean up a room and the room is still dirty, well, it's an obvious thing. There's no arguing. They can't come and say, yeah, I cleaned it. Well, look, there's stuff all over the floor. That's something that people can't argue with. But if you say, well, you're lazy and inconsiderate, well, now you're talking about the internal nature of a person and you're judging their motives, you're judging their identity. And the fact is, you don't know if they're lazy and inconsiderate. Even if you have 10 years of evidence toward that fact, you still can't definitively say anything like that. If a person was motivated, would suddenly they change? Could they have had 10 years of not being motivated? by some means. And therefore, how do we really know these things? It's always up to debate. It's always up to argument. And if you're dealing with someone that's not passive, then they're going to fight back. They're going to say, I don't think that was fair for you to say. Or worse, if you say something like that to a passive-aggressive style of communicator, then you're very much likely to obtain an enemy in your life that is going to go around behind your back and sabotage everything that you do. Do you really want to do that? The author says this. He says, your goal is to make a request, not to invite the other person to argue. As well, accusing the person of having a negative personality trait or poor motive is likely to make them defensive, and they will resist the rest of your message. Always focus on the behavior. So that's the first step in making a request. Simply, in 1 or 2 sentences, if you can, describe the situation at hand. Focus on the behavior if you're going to deal with something like that from a person, not on their personality. The next thing you want to do is to express. First is describe, second is to express. And this is expressing how you are feeling in the situation. So you're first describing the situation. You haven't done the chore like you agreed to. The next thing is you're going to express how you feel at that moment in time. Now, you need to state how you feel very clearly, but don't act them out. So I've seen many people who will suddenly, if they say that made me angry, they start becoming angry as they talk about being angry then. If they say that it made them down, then they will act as if they're going through a massive depressive spell at that very moment in time. You've got to rein your emotions in. You need to state your emotions very clearly, but not actually let them come out and act on them. As much as you can, you should emphasize the positive in things. Sometimes it's very appropriate to say, I got very angry when you did that. But it may be more helpful to twist that around to a positive and say, I don't feel as close to you as I would like when you do this. See, that's a very different, it's still saying the same thing in a way, but one thing is saying, I get very angry when you do this. Well, that's a negative statement. Instead of saying, I don't feel as close to you, that's saying, I value this relationship with you. I actually want to be close to you. I want that intimacy, or I want that relationship with you. But every time you do this, I don't feel like we have that connection point anymore. Much better way of emphasizing the positive angle in your emotions rather than the negative angle of the emotions. As much as you can, stay calm, say things with a very even tone, watch your body language, make sure you're not taking a very aggressive style in your body language and your facial expressions. Try to use I statements as much as you can, such as, I'm feeling overwhelmed, which is a lot better to say than no one could stand this, or this is unbearable, which are all kind of vague statements. I statements make it much more personal, and you're saying, I feel this way. I want to be closer to you. I don't feel as close to you, as instead of just vague type of things. The author also mentions to avoid martyrdom, and that is when you feel like you're at the brunt of everything bad in the world. Poor me, let me have a pity party. And in order for you to attend my pity party, you need to bring me a gift of pity. And crazy as it is, most people, I've mentioned this before, don't show up to my pity party. Oh man, I have a great party planned with all sorts of wonderful gifts and parting gifts and food, and no one shows up. How crazy is that for me to even have such a party? You need to state how you feel, but don't go overboard. Don't make it into such big spectacle for people. State how you feel, very simple, and then move on. Now, sometimes, and the author mentions this, sometimes you may skip this express stage. If you're dealing with something that is very quick, somebody does something, you're at an airport, you're about to miss your flight, well, maybe now's not the time to say, I feel very upset that you're making me miss my flight. No, instead you can say, describe, I'm about to miss my flight, and then go right into your request and skip all the stuff about how it's making you feel at that moment. Usually the express stage is much more applicable for people that you want relationships with, that you want to build life with. And that doesn't necessarily mean a spouse or anything like a family situation. It could be a work relationship. But if it's a work relationship, it's really important to you. And therefore, you want to build kind of that emotional connection with that person. And if that's the case, then you do want to express those things. In a lot of cases, expressing doesn't really make as big of a deal, especially in just casual business acquaintances or transactions or things like that. So we're going to describe the situation. We're going to express how we're feeling in that situation. And then the third step is to specify. That is when you actually make your request. Now, it's always a good thing to think about this ahead of time and not just be too spontaneous. You know, I'm a big fan of being spontaneous in life. I don't like a lot of formulas and scripting of things in life if you can help it. But occasionally it's very good, and this is one of those instances, if you decide ahead of time what it is that you want, what it is that you're going to ask about, and not think of it on the spot, spontaneous, because many times you will end up being vague in your request. Many times you will dip into your emotions and you will let them be too much of a dictator in how you are responding to other people. So you need to think a little bit ahead about this. We said this earlier, but you need to be very clear and very brief. You need to avoid going on and on and on about things. In fact, as a good rule of thumb, you should basically make a request that is really no more than 1 or 2 sentences. And this may take some practice. In fact, as again, this book is a workbook, the Assertiveness workbook, and there's several examples in the back of the book, as every chapter, where you really practice this. And this is something, if you're not used to, you should practice, because some of us are used to asking for things, but wow, we can ask for 5 or 10 minutes. We can just go on and on. And to whittle that down to just 1 or 2 sentences, this is very similar to what I've been talking about in my email experiments, how I basically have gone down to 3-sentence emails. And I'm still doing that, and I'm having a lot of success. In fact, I was thinking the other day how it might be good, maybe after this series is over, to do 2 or 3 weeks where we talk about some of those issues, very practical issues of emails and things like that. And all this stuff about 1 to 2 or 3 sentence replies, and just kind of go into some of the research about that, talk about some of the practical things. I think it would be very helpful. But in asking for things in your life, brief is better. Here's what the author says. He says, be specific. Here's a bad example. I'd like you to take a more active role on the committee. Now, what does that even mean exactly? Take a more active role. Active, what does that mean? And what role are you even talking about? That's a request, but it's a very vague request. It's not very clear. It may be brief, but it's not very clear. Here's what the author says is a better request. I'd like you to handle the fundraising for the next 6 months. So it's very clear. You're going to do the fundraising. You're going to do it for 6 months. This is my request of you. Also, another hint, another tip, just as we were talking about in the expressing the feelings mode, you need to try your best to frame the request positively. Here's what the author says about this. Say what you want, not what you don't want. And that's a very hard thing, but it's a very wise thing. It's a very productive thing to put in your life. Say what you want, not what you don't want. For example, I'd like the garbage to be taken out by 8 o'clock is much better than don't be so lazy about taking the garbage out. That last statement is a little bit too emotional. It's very vague, and it's emphasizing more of the negative because it's now focusing on the person's motive, their identity. Don't be so lazy. Instead of just saying, I would like the garbage to be taken out by 8 o'clock. Very specific and positive in focus. As again we said in the express category, you need to focus on behavior. What do you want the person to do? Don't ask them to change who they are. Don't ask them to change how they think or how they feel. So don't say, stop being this way. Quit being so contentious or something like that. That is asking them to change how they're thinking or feeling. Is not asking them to change what they are doing. So we are making a request. We have described the situation. We have expressed how we feel in the situation. We have specified what we would like to happen in this situation. And then the 4th step in this formula of making a request is outcome. And that is where you describe the outcome of what you will think. And in this step, you are describing what you think will happen if the other person does or does not go along with what you are requesting. And again, this has been called consequences before by the people who actually invented this. The author has changed this to outcome because it's a little bit more of the result rather than some type of punishment, which is what he reads into the word consequences. So the author gives 4 basic categories of what might be an outcome and what you might express to someone. The first one is the feelings category. The fact is that if you do what I'm asking you, I'm just going to feel better. And you tell somebody, I'd really like that much better if you could do that. I would feel so much more comfortable if you did this. I would feel so less overwhelmed if you would be able to do this. You have specified what it is that you would like to ask someone to do. Now you're telling them how you're going to feel if they actually go along with this. It is much more about what would happen if the person does go along with what you're requesting. Another category is just result. So it's not necessarily how you feel, but it's some concrete result that's going to happen in the outside world. It's going to be something observable. So if you are able to do this, we'll be able to get the project in on time. Or if you could do this, it would make us get along so much more closely and more intimate. We'll get along so much better if you can do this. I think if you're able to do this, it would increase our customer sentiment by many points. That would be a tremendous thing for us. Very concrete result, very something that's observable. The third thing is a reward. So this is something that I think we have to be careful about. The author kind of mentions the last one as something we need to be careful about, which is punishment. But I also think we need to be a little bit careful about reward. I think most of the time we just need to tell people, this is why I think you should go along with my request, is because of my feelings. And if I mean something to you, then I hope you would take into consideration my feelings. The most effective way, I think, is a result. This is the observable thing that's going to happen, usually, hopefully, a positive thing if you go along with what I'm saying. The reward thing, I don't know. Sometimes this honestly feels to me a little bit like manipulation, such as what the author says. If you do this, then I'll give you a massage when we get home. Or if you do that, I'll take over the laundry this week. Or if you do this, then you can have the car next Thursday. And I think there may be times and places for that, especially maybe if they're more family members, children especially. I think that may be applicable. Rewarding children for good behavior and things like that, I think is a good thing. But I think it should be used sparingly because, again, I just really feel like that can border on manipulation and tempt us too much to go into an aggressive style where we're thinking that it's about people doing what we want. And all we're saying is that if you really feel like something resonates with you, then express that and ask people of things, but don't be upset if they say no to you or go ballistic on them. And rewarding people can tempt you to dip over into, well, I will do something to make you say yes to me. And that's not the point. The point isn't, and I know this is a very hard thing to learn, and I'm not saying I'm a master at this, I'm still learning this, to think of a situation where expressing what you're wanting is the whole goal, not getting them to agree with you, not getting them to say yes to you. And this is why that reward can be a little bit deceptive if you're not careful. Punishment is definitely one, and that's the last category. And he recommends people overuse this way too much to get what they want. Rewarding is usually more effective. It should be used very extremely sparingly, even if it's with children. And here's what the author says at the end of this chapter. He says, in most situations, take some extra time to frame your consequences in a positive way. Consider adopting the 3-to-1 policy. This means that you strive to give at least 3 times as many rewards as punishment and 3 times as many compliments as criticisms. One more tip about outcomes. People often make outcome statements that are vague or excessive. These are unlikely to come true. If you do this, others will learn not to take you seriously. Here are some poor outcome statements, such as, or I'll ground you for the entire year. Yeah, that doesn't really ever happen. If you don't, boy, you are going to get it. Well, get what exactly? What do you mean? That's very vague. Then if you do this, then I'll love you forever. Well, you'll love me until the next time you demand something from me. And so don't say you're going to love me forever as if it's unconditional from that point on. Or then everything will work out perfectly if you do this. Well, nothing's going to work out perfectly. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be without error in some way. So we see these 4 steps. If it resonates with you, then put it into action. This describe, this express, this specify, outcome. If it helps you to start asking people, making requests of people, then put that into play. But if you kind of get the feel of it, then don't feel like you have to think about this verbatim like this. The author gives 3 examples I want to read for you using this describe, express, specify, and outcome. The first one, Ivan, when I arrived at the river, I realized that you hadn't sent the paddles on ahead. That's describe. I was frustrated because that meant we didn't have enough for everyone to practice with. That's express. I'd like you to come up with a plan to ensure that on future trips, everything gets packed and sent and then run it past me. That is specify, making your request. That way, I can feel more confident taking people out there and I won't be hassling you afterwards. That's the outcome. Here's another one. Allison, when you tell me I don't love you, that's describe, it makes me feel both awful and misunderstood. That's express, because I do love you very much. If you're feeling unloved, I wish you'd tell me right away and we can talk about it. There's your request, specify. Maybe then we can figure out what happens rather than getting into arguments about what I feel. That is the outcome. And then the last example, he says, I keep running out of money before the end of the month and I don't know how I'll get by. That's describe. That makes me feel anxious. That's express. Would you be willing to sit down with me over coffee and go over my finances to see what I can do about this? That is specify. I'd really appreciate it. That is the outcome. Very simple. I'd really appreciate it. That's just your feelings there. So I hope this helps. And I hope you see why it's important, if you're going to live an assertive lifestyle, that you do make requests for people, but you do it in such a way that you're not controlling other people and you quit worrying about controlling other people. You just simply ask and don't try to worry about if they say yes to you. Now, granted, we all would love that if we make requests that people would just say yes, that they would be like a genie in the bottle and just pop out and grant us our every wish. That just isn't going to happen. And I think that we worry too much about that. We should just make requests and go for it, and then not worry about what people say. Not try to manipulate them, not trying to change their mind, just simply asking and then going forth from that. That is truly being assertive, when you are being honest with yourself, expressing yourself, and at the same time not trying to manipulate or control what other people think or feel. Much, much, much easier said than done. This is a lifestyle habit. Everything we've talked about really is a lifestyle habit. This isn't a matter that you're just going to master this in a week. This is going to be a lifelong journey that you're constantly going to be improving in, that you're constantly going to see insights in, and as always, something that you need to occasionally practice in. As I've always said, I said this earlier in the episode, there are many exercises at the end of this book. One where you're writing out a describe, express, specify outcome script. One where you're going through and actually making requests assertively. And it gives many examples of how you can practice this by yourself in front of a mirror or with a partner, where you're putting your script into action and actually doing the describe, express, specify, and outcome. So anyway, I think that's going to do it for today. We're trying to get my episodes under a shorter length. I know many times I've gone well into the near hour mark, and so hopefully we'll be within the 30-minute mark this week, and you found this information helpful and practical in putting the assertiveness style more into your primary mode of communication with other people. Now, next week, we are dealing with countdown to confrontation. So the author divides confrontation up into 2 chapters, the countdown to confrontation and then constructive confrontation. So dealing with confrontation and also what happens when we must occasionally confront as well. Not just give constructive feedback, but sometimes we actually do have to confront. How do we do that and not violate the principle of assertiveness that we've been building week after week on this program? So this is kind of where we're ending up on this particular series. Well, that's going to wrap up this episode on making requests of other people. As always, please consider leaving me any type of rating, any kind of comment on iTunes, Stitcher, BlackBerry, any place that you're listening to me at. Would just really love if you have the time and would be willing, especially if you are a new listener to the show. I think the last comments, I'm just pulled up iTunes, and I've had some comments back in April. Now these I think are only US, and sometimes some foreign comments don't always show up here if it's outside the US. But Kaylin said back in April 16, said, very informative and interesting. I think I'm really going to benefit from what I'm learning here. Karen in April 13th says, this is now one of my favorite podcasts. So I appreciate both of your comments on that, but I haven't had any comments since April. And if you've never left me a comment, if you've left me a comment, you can't leave me anymore on iTunes. It's just one comment for the entire podcast, not per episode. But if you are new to the show and you haven't left me a rating or comment, would love to hear from you. Would love to hear your thoughts and things like that. Also have a discussion area set up at firstthingsproductivity.com/44. That's the number 44. Go all the way down to the very bottom. You can leave me a comment. It doesn't require you to register for anything. There's also a voicemail option. You can also reach me through Twitter or Facebook. So until next time, remember this. You actually do have a right. In fact, it is really the only respect you can give yourself if you do make requests of other people, if you let other people into your world. And if there's something that you would like to see, then request it. And the worst that can happen is that someone says no. The point is that you requested it, not that they said yes, nor that they said no. If they say yes or no, that's their business. Your business is that you make that request. That is the assertive lifestyle. And I would encourage you to go forward and do that and put it into practice in your life. As always, embrace today with passion and intention, and don't die with your music still inside you.